Well, you're finally having me on your show, Ayesha, after all these months when I've been desperate to come on and you've not wanted me. And now, thank you for having me on. Your career's taken off, but it's nice that you're still willing to chat to me.
And of course, you've been busy yourself recently making use of your time. And here is your new book. So the book is really interesting. It's called Go Big, How to Fix the World. It's born out of your podcast, Reasons to Be Cheerful. And it's trying to put forward, well, my takeaway was it was trying to put forward a kind of an optimistic vision for sort of progressive ideas. The left and progressives are not in power, but there are things that can be done. We shouldn't have a council of despair. These are the big ideas. Is that broadly sort of the thinking behind it?
Yes, I think that's right. I think it's saying a number of things. First of all, that when you think about the last 10 years in Britain, we've had the financial crisis, we've had the extraordinary and enormous political upheaval of Brexit, and now we've had coronavirus and all the devastation that has caused, but also what it's illustrated about some of the issues in our country, whether it's inequality, deprivation, the pay of key workers, public services. And my case in the book is that all of these crises in their different ways demand big responses, big change. And then you look forward, and we're in the decisive decade when it comes to the climate crisis. I'm Shadow Business Secretary, which covers the climate. This is the 10 years, this decade of the 10 years that matter enormously to the future. And so that can't demand a small response, it's got to demand a big response. And that's the if you like, the first case of it. And the second thing I'm saying is there are answers out there. It's easy to despair. It's easy to think there aren't answers, but look around the world, lift our eyes from the day-to-day of British politics, and you see answers from Iceland to Mongolia to Finland to Ireland, all over the world. Okay. There is inspiration we can take, and we can learn from what other countries are doing, and indeed what's being done in our own country.
The book spans lots of big policy ideas, from the climate crisis, economic inequality, employee ownership trust schemes. There's lots of stuff there. But just maybe pick out one or two of the big ideas that really caught your imagination and which you think could apply to this country.
I mean, one I think that is really interesting is this dad's leave, because it's interesting in itself, but also what it means more broadly. So take Iceland, for example. We were talking on my podcast to the Icelandic Prime Minister recently. In Iceland, they now have 6 months for mums paid at 80% when their babies are born, 6 months paid at 80% for mums, and 6 months paid at 80% for dads. And now some of that leave is transferable, so it can be transferred between the mum and the dad, but 4.5 months of it has got to be taken by the dad, or it can't be used. And lots of the Nordic countries have similar systems. Now, why is that important? Well, one, it's about the time that dads get to spend with their newborn babies. It's 2 weeks in the UK, 2 weeks paternity leave. Secondly, it's a massive tool for tackling gender inequality, because gender inequality really takes off in terms of pay in the workplace when babies are born. And if you like, rebalances it, it has the same expectations of mothers and fathers in terms of the time they can take off. But it also says something really important, which is about whether you've got children or not, which is about the role of family and work and what should have priority. And so just in that, what seems like a very specific idea, I think it says something bigger about our society. So that's one I'm really interested in.
Just pick up on that. We do have shared parental leave. In fact, I think it was a coalition government.
It was
that introduced it, but the take up was very low, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair to Nick Clegg,
yeah.
I always like to be fair to Nick Clegg, as you know. He pushed for this in the coalition government. But it's so interesting, Ayesha, because this is the way you need to learn from other countries. The whole way this has been done is, well, it's the mum's leave, but it can be shared, basically. And so what's the take-up of dads? It's 3%. Now, partly that's because it's very badly paid, 150 quid a week, basically. So it's only 2 weeks, really. And it's not saying use it or lose it. It's just sort of saying, well, and so basically the default option is it's going to be the mum that takes it, partly because of earnings inequality. So And the Swedes and others did this in the 1970s, a kind of shared parental leave model, and didn't work. And that was when Nick Clegg and I, as you know, were toddlers. So we kind of could have learned from what was happening back then.
So that's one idea. Give us another big idea.
Housing. Everyone knows we have a housing crisis in this country. It's long running. Neither party solved it. High house prices, a private rented sector that is very insecure, very expensive. What's the one thing we haven't tried in 40 years? Build social housing at scale. Go to Vienna, they build social housing at scale and they don't have the same housing crisis. And it's a capital city of Austria. And, you can live there more or less whether you're rich or poor. Why is that a good thing? Well, it's much fairer. It means you have mixed communities, not communities increasingly divided by income and wealth. It could make a massive difference. No government in a long time, in decades, as I say, has really tried to do this at scale. I was part of a social housing commission, actually, funnily enough, with Saida Varsi, who was former chair of the Conservative Party, and she and I came together on this issue. So, and I think that could be a massive legacy for any government to build social housing at scale.
So look, the book is really, really interesting. There's bags of fascinating ideas.
It makes you cheerful, optimistic, yeah?
Yeah, I will admit.
I know you're an objective, serious, radio presenter, but I mean, it can make you. And by the way, Ayesha, it's not just, you say it's progressive ideas. There'll be people who think that Ed Miliband, I could never have voted for him ever. I don't like him. I don't like his politics. One of the things we try to do in the podcast, and I try and do in the book, is to say, look, this isn't just about the left. Some of these ideas can be adopted by the right. Saida Varsi, who I mentioned, is actually on the cover of the book, giving it a nice endorsement. I think some of these ideas could be taken up by the right of politics. And so, and it's obviously where I'm coming from, and I think this maybe goes to something which I've learned in the last 6 years. The yahoo of politics really puts people off. And this is trying to say I think ideas really matter in politics. And, there isn't a monopoly of wisdom.
I suppose the question that a lot of my listeners will want to know, and this is the question that went through my head as I read the book, because it's very much your voice, your values, your vision, very much your manifesto. So the obvious question is, when you were leader trying to become prime minister, why didn't you go bigger with some of these ideas?
I think I underestimated the electorate. I think I underestimated the fact that people wanted greater boldness than I was offering. I sometimes say I was too bold for the people who didn't want boldness, and not reassuring enough for the people who wanted reassurance. I was sort of caught in the middle. So I think partly, I underestimated people's appetite for change, and I think we saw that with the Brexit referendum and with 2017 as well, 2017 election. We were coming out of government. I remember at the time I was seen as Red Ed. I was described as Red Ed. And I think that is what's so interesting about political debate, Ayesha, which is, think about some of the things that I was talking about, which were controversial: inequality, predatory companies, freezing energy prices, which David Cameron famously described as, I was living in a Marxist universe. Well, I don't think we are living in a Marxist universe, but that is now government policy. I think it's a sign that political debate has shifted. So I think there's a sort of range of reasons, and you learn from experience. And I suppose I've learned, from experience.
If you could have your time again, would you want to be braver and more courageous?
Yes, definitely. It's one of the hardest things in politics, and that from being, from working for me. And you were always saying to me, make bigger choices, make stronger choices. So some of the most crucial moments, you were saying that to me. And you were right about that. But there's so many pressures on you. And any politician who says, I never compromise, isn't telling you the truth. There's always a balance between principle and compromise. People don't think of Jeremy Corbyn as a compromiser, but there's lots of things he compromised on too, I'm sure. So it's always about that. But I did my best following my instincts as they were at the time. But I think looking back on it with the benefit of hindsight, I should have been bolder.
You talk about the fact that a lot of your ideas, which were derided as kind of, frightening Marxist propositions, are now the conventional wisdom in politics. Why do you think it is that the Conservative Party, led by Boris Johnson, has been able to kind of shapeshift and move into this new evolving centre ground, and more people who used to be Labour voters, traditional working class people, feel more comfortable with a Conservative proposition than they do a Labour proposition? Why is it that the Conservatives seem to have a story that connects with people's lives now, and the Labour Party continues to not have that?
The way to think about politics in the last decade or so is that David Cameron to Theresa May, obviously marked by the Brexit referendum, was a big moment of change. Because the Conservative Party went from, when I was leader, saying, we don't agree with your characterisation of the country. We don't agree with that there are these deep inequalities that need to be tackled. That was what Cameron's position was. And the Remain argument, if you remember, the Cameron-Osborne argument was, things are good, so vote for carrying on. And people say, well, actually, enough people thought things aren't very good, thank you very much, so we're not going to vote for that. And in a way, May marked the beginning of that change, because when she did her speech on the steps of Downing Street about the burning injustices, that marked a shift. And Johnson, in a way, with his what he calls levelling up, is talking about that too. Now, why did Johnson win in 2019? I think that was more to do with Brexit, actually. It wasn't that people voted for his levelling up agenda. People voted because, to some extent,
But just why did he win in Hartlepool a couple of weeks ago and in the council elections?
I think there's a number of reasons for that. I think, first of all, we're in the middle of a terrible pandemic, and I think people rally around governments. We, as Labour, have a job to do, which is to recover from the 2019 general election, which was a terrible defeat, and to set out a vision of the future. And it's been hard during the pandemic, but I think that's what we've got to do. And Keir Starmer knows that's what we've got to do. And, Ayesha, I tend to think about this. You and I, when I was leader, saw lots of opinion polls, lots of which saw me as ahead. Opinion polls are a snapshot, not a prediction. And it's really important to make that distinction. And, I think there's two phases of politics. There's politics of the pandemic and during the pandemic. And hopefully soon we will start to get through the pandemic, and we're obviously seeing an opening up. And then there will be a different set of questions, which is, if you like, who will win the peace? What kind of country do we want to build after the pandemic? And that's where I think Labour has to pitch its tent. And I know that's what Keir thinks, where Keir thinks Labour has to pitch its tent.
I mean, Ed, do you think that you will see a Labour government in your lifetime?
Of course. You're not old enough to remember this, but in 1992, after Labour lost its fourth general election, I heard all the same stuff that people are saying now. Labour's never going to win again. It's existential. That isn't to say I underestimate Labour's challenges. We have massive challenges. We have shifting demographics. We have changing class allegiances. We have a shape-shifting Conservative Party. But I actually do believe, I am optimistic, that if we set out, in the end in politics, you've got to just set out your vision. And you've got to say, this is what we believe, this is what we'd like to do to the country, and then the country's got to decide. And I think it is absolutely all to play for. And anyone who says, after the last 6 years of Brexit, Trump, the 2017 general election, two general elections, all of that has happened. Anyone who says, oh, well, I know the future, and the 2023, 2024 general election is already decided for Boris Johnson, I mean, I think that is a mug's game, honestly.
But Ed, a lot of my listeners will say, hang on a minute, like for Keir Starmer to win the next general election, he has to get a bigger swing than Tony Blair did in 1997. And there's lots of obstacles. I'm going to come to Brexit in a minute, but, Scotland is very, very difficult for the Labour Party. This, infamous red wall looks like it's solidifying. That's the message from the local council elections. What does the Labour Party, what does Keir Starmer have to do? Some practical things. You talk about Labour needs to, pitch its tent in the right place. But we're not hearing very much about that from the Labour Party.
Well, look, I mean, in a way, Ayesha, part of my contribution, I didn't write this book in my role explicitly as a shadow business secretary, but part of my contribution is this book to say, look, there are big ideas out there. A Green New Deal to create green jobs across our country. But the government, you might say, well, the government's doing that, aren't they? Well, no, they're not. They're not doing it at scale. Nothing like the scale that Biden is doing. Building social housing, as we've discussed, and the impact that could have. The kind of policies for mums and dads that I've discussed. The best investment we can make in the future, universal childcare, addressing the care crisis, the social care crisis. So there are lots of ideas out there. And I think the task for Labour is to be explicit about those ideas. You don't blow the final whistle a third of the way through the football match, which is probably where we are in terms of the next general election. So have we got a massive challenge? Of course we do. And Keir has been the first person to say that, including when he became leader. 6 or 9 months ago, people were writing off Boris Johnson. I think it's really all to play for.
I just want to ask you a couple of current questions just about stuff that's happening right now. Brexit, for example. I mean, your constituency is very, very interesting. Doncaster, very, very high Leave seat.
Yeah.
The party has kind of made a decision that it's not going to relitigate Brexit. Yet very recently, Gordon Brown has come out and said, well, actually, he would want to see Britain rejoin the EU. A lot of Labour's core base are very much in the camp where they want Britain to rejoin the EU. Where are you on this?
Well, look, I think the party's made the right decision. I think the Remain Leave issue is settled. It was a once in a generation decision. Lots of people don't like that decision, but honestly, we're not reopening that. I'm completely clear about that.
Do you think Gordon's wrong on this?
Oh no, I think Gordon's entitled to his view, but I don't agree with him. Look, the country made a decision at the Brexit referendum. They reaffirmed that decision through the 2019 general election. I genuinely believe it is settled. And I think the question now is what kind of post-Brexit, post membership of the EU future do we build as a country? And I think that's where Labour's focus needs to be. And all of the massive challenges that we've already talked about in this interview. So I think that's where Labour needs to be.
Okay. Boris Johnson's going to let the country know on Monday whether June the 21st should happen. As shadow business secretary, what are you hoping for? You must be business all the time.
That we've got to be led by the science. And I'm not going to second guess that now because he's got access to the scientific information. But crucially, whatever decision is made on the science and the June 21st reopening, it's got to be matched by the economic support for business. So in other words, if reopening is delayed, that might be the right thing to do if the science tells us that, or if it's partially delayed, or if the social distancing has to stay in place for longer. The hospitality sector, 25% of whom can't open, the wedding sector still restricted, nightclubs, all of the businesses that are facing restrictions have got to have that economic support, Ayesha, because they have been through such a difficult 15 months. Of course, the whole country's been through it, but lots of businesses are quite on the edge. And, obviously that's something I talk to in my day job all the time. I talk to businesses, business representatives, and they are very clear about this. I tell you one other interesting thing that they say to me, as talking to them this week about this, they want irreversibility. So in other words, they're not saying to government, just go full steam ahead irrespective, because what they don't want is a reopening and then a reversal. So get this right, be led by the science, but please provide the economic support. They must provide the economic support. And we've had this pattern with this government throughout this crisis, which is the economic support has tended to lag behind the public health decisions. And that can't happen this time.
But does the Labour Party have a view on whether things should open on the 21st?
That we've got to be led by the science on this. And we don't have access to all of the science. That's something that Boris Johnson will be sitting with Sage and his advisors and do that. We're not pushing the government to just go full steam ahead if that isn't the right thing to do. But they've got to be led by the scientific information that they have.
I want to end this just, I suppose, with some kind of personal reflections, because of course, as we said at the beginning, we worked together for a long time in politics. And we're friends as well. I mean, when you look back on your time, what are the best bits and the worst bits of being leader of the Labour Party?
The best bits for me were the moments when you connected with people about the things I was saying about the country. Whether that's when I hope I'm allowed to say this on Times Radio, when I stood up to Rupert Murdoch, when, I spoke to the issues around energy and vested interests, when I talked about, I always used to think that the conference speech, which, as you know, I took incredibly seriously, was a moment when you could talk to the country about where it was and where it could go. And I think the moments that I, felt best about was when I sort of spoke in a way that resonated with people. The One Nation conference speech, which was saying, what kind of vision can we build for our future? When I drew attention to the cost of living crisis that so many people were facing. And the other thing that is the best bit, and I genuinely believe this, and some people doubt this, is the people you meet and the privilege of hearing people's stories about themselves, about their wishes for the country, for themselves, their families. That is an incredible privilege. And actually, as I meet people, and people still obviously recognize me, maybe less than they did, but people recognize me. You're the bloke who used to be in politics. People are incredibly nice. And actually, I think, funnily enough, from being a public figure, you have a much more positive view of the British people than people might expect. I don't get lots of people coming up to me saying how much they hate me. I'm sure there are people in that category, but people are incredibly nice. So they're the best bits about the job and about my experience.
What were the worst?
And obviously working with you.
Obviously.
I took a bit too long to get to that.
Yeah. I was like, come on, speed it up. What about the worst bits? Was it PMQs?
PMQs was often a low moment, wasn't it? It was the funny thing about PMQs is that people think doing PMQs once must be really hard. No, doing it once is not the hardest thing. It's doing it 142 times that is the hard thing. It's the grind. Now, I don't know, PMQs was difficult. The bacon sandwich wasn't a highlight. The Edstone wasn't brilliant.
Out of all the gaffes,
you go
which
on.
one?
But hang on, all the gaffes. Sorry, just like rephrase that, please.
There was a lot of gaffes. There always is in politics.
Yeah, okay, that's true. It is the thick of it.
Which is the gaffe you think did you most damage?
Oh, I don't know. What do you think? The bacon sandwich?
Can you still eat? Do you still enjoy a bacon sandwich, or are you slightly
I've
triggered
cut back
by
on the red meat a little bit, but you know what I think our mistake was on the bacon sandwich. I mean, clearly eating the sandwich wasn't strategically brilliant, but I actually think it was not leaning into it more. In other words, people can tease you about things that you look embarrassed about,
or you're ashamed about.
But it's much harder to take the mickey out of you about things that you own yourself. I didn't lose the election to the bacon sandwich. I mean, I just don't buy that.
Why do you think you did lose the election?
Because David Cameron got more votes than me. Boom, boom. No, I mean, more people wanted Cameron to be prime minister than me. I've got to accept that. Leadership.
Why?
I think a combination of things. He was the prime minister and he had incumbency. The Tories had only been in, 5 years? I think the whole issue of were we going to be in league, in coalition with the SNP became a significant issue in the election. I think austerity had started, but people didn't have that fatigue. Actually, living standards were starting to rise again at that moment. So I think that election could have gone either way, actually. But we always knew. I said when I took over in 2010, the stars have really got to be aligned for you to come back in one go. I was doing COP questions. We've got COP26 in Glasgow in November, which is a big moment on climate change, which maybe I can come back on your show if you'll have me and talk about. But I was doing COP questions, and it was at 11:30, so it's just before PMQs, and I asked my questions at the end. And then Keir Starmer came in at PMQs, and I remember, and I was just thinking to myself, I am so pleased I don't do PMQs anymore. I am so pleased. David Cameron or William Hague said to me when I first became leader, you'll wake up on a Wednesday in recess, you'll open your eyes and you'll think, thank God it's not PMQs today. And it is totally true. I mean, I'm not saying PMQs was the worst part of the job, but it was a grind, wasn't it? The funny thing is about PMQs, the thing I learned most of all, Blair said this to me actually on a trip somewhere. He said, people think PMQs is all about the questions you ask. Actually, what matters much more is the joust. Because we used to have a set of, given that there was a range of attacks Cameron could make on me, we used to have a list of their attacks and then the rejoinders. And actually, but my best moment at PMQs, probably the best line, when he said, you're a student politician, and I said, at least I wasn't wrecking restaurants and chucking bread rolls.
How do you think Keir Starmer is doing at PMQs? Because, I mean, Boris Johnson is quite good at that joust, as you said. He lends himself to that quite well, whereas Keir Starmer is much more of a sort of forensic, sticking to the question.
But, I think the prosecutorial thing's pretty good, actually. I think he does it pretty well. He does it much better than I did it, in that sense. I mean, he does prosecute the case. I mean, he does. I was just striking that watching it the other day. He really did I thought he put, like it was on education funding, I thought he did put Boris Johnson on the back foot, actually. By the way, it will change again when the House of Commons, fills up again. Because I think it's a very different, I don't know what you think, but I think it's a very different.
Well, I think it's going to be interesting when the chamber fills up, because I think both participants will have a lot more noise, which gives them more confidence. But Boris Johnson, I think, will have an advantage when the chamber comes back. I think that will suit his style of oratory. He is a natural crowd pleaser in terms of his oratory, his jokes, and his side will also be very up for it. So I think it will. I hope that the whole chamber does come back soon. I think it will make PMQs a bit more lively again. Well, Ed,
I'm very glad never to be doing PMQ. I did actually ask a few questions as a backbencher at PMQs, but I'm very glad I don't have to do it ever again.
No, you would never think about putting your hat in the ring for leader again.
Definitely not, Ayesha.
Well, listen, Ed, it's been such a pleasure to speak with you. Your book is out now, Go Big, How to Fix the World. It's really, really interesting. Lots of big ideas from, as you say, across the world and across the political and policy spectrum. Thank you so much for speaking to Times Radio.
Well, thank you for having me.